The royal family secret so twisted it makes the Red Wedding look like a wholesome family reunion. What if I told you that the greatest threat to House Targaryen was never Robert's rebellion, never the Faith Militant uprising, and definitely not the Dance of the Dragons, but rather a genetic time bomb ticking inside every silver-haired member of the dynasty? A hereditary madness, so predictable that Westerosi lords developed a saying about flipping coins just to cope with the terrifying randomness of whether their next king would be brilliant or batshit insane. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms pulls back the curtain on the Targaryen dynasty's darkest secret, showing us in brutal detail how centuries of keeping the bloodline pure created monsters wearing crowns and calling it divine right. Welcome to Westeros' throne, where we are exposing the genetic nightmare that the Targaryens called family tradition and explaining why their fall was not just inevitable, but biologically guaranteed. If you love discovering that your favorite royal family is actually a cautionary tale about why you should absolutely diversify your gene pool, hit that subscribe button like you're breaking a centuries-old incestuous marriage pact, and smash that notification bell, because we're delivering revelations more shocking than finding out your aunt is also your grandmother on this channel. And you do not want to miss what disturbing historical fact we are uncovering next. Let us start with the foundation of this genetic disaster: the Valyrian obsession with blood purity that the Targaryens inherited and then cranked up to 11. The Valyrians believed their ability to bond with dragons came from their unique bloodline, and they were not entirely wrong. Dragon riding does seem to be a genetic trait that runs in certain families, which meant that preserving that bloodline was not just vanity, it was a strategic necessity for maintaining their military superiority. But here is where things went catastrophically wrong. The Targaryens decided that the best way to preserve dragon riding genetics was through sibling marriage, parent-child unions, and generally keeping things so close within the family that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a telephone pole. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms takes place during the reign of various Targaryen kings, and the series does not shy away from showing us the consequences of this breeding strategy. We see Targaryens who are brilliant, visionary leaders sitting on the throne one generation, and then their children or grandchildren are hearing voices, setting fires for fun, or making decisions so divorced from reality that their advisors spend entire meetings just trying to figure out how to implement the king's latest insane decree without causing a civil war. The coin flip metaphor that gets used throughout the series is not hyperbole. It is observable statistical reality that terrifies everyone who has to live under Targaryen rule. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The Targaryens knew about the madness problem. They watched it happen generation after generation, saw siblings descend into paranoia and violence, witnessed children born with deformities or cognitive issues, and their solution was to keep doing exactly the same thing while hoping for different results. That is not just genetic roulette, that is willful denial on a scale that would make a gambling addict look responsible. The Maesters documented this pattern, the lords whispered about it in private, and everyone just collectively agreed to pretend that marrying your sister was totally normal and definitely would not have consequences. The specific examples that a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms references are genuinely horrifying when you dig into them. Aerion Brightflame, one of the Targaryen princes during Dunk and Egg's time, believed he could literally transform into a dragon if he drank wildfire, which is medieval napalm that burns so hot it melts stone. Spoiler alert. Drinking wildfire does not turn you into a dragon. It turns you into a briefly flaming corpse, which Aerion discovered the hard way. This was not an isolated incident of temporary insanity. This was a prince who had exhibited erratic and cruel behavior his entire life, torturing people for entertainment and genuinely believing he was above human limitations because of his special dragon blood. Then there was Baelor the Blessed, who sounds great until you realize his particular form of madness was extreme religious zealotry combined with self-destructive asceticism. Baelor fasted so extensively that he literally starved himself to death because he believed eating was too worldly. He locked his own sisters in the Red Keep because he found them too beautiful and worried they would tempt him into sin, which is deeply concerning on multiple levels. He walked barefoot through a pit of vipers to prove his faith and somehow survived, which everyone took as evidence of divine favor rather than evidence that maybe this guy should not be making important governmental decisions. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms shows us Aegon V, Egg himself, who actually turns out to be one of the better Targaryen monarchs despite, or perhaps because of his unconventional upbringing away from court. But even Egg cannot escape the family curse. His obsession with hatching dragon eggs, believing that restoring dragons would solve the realm's problems, leads directly to the tragedy at Summerhall, where his eldest son, and many others die in a catastrophic fire. Even the good Targaryens end up destroyed by their dynasty's obsessions, proving that the problem is not individual weakness, but systemic dysfunction built into the family's entire identity. The really twisted part is how the Targaryen propaganda machine managed to spin this genetic disaster into religious doctrine. They convinced a significant portion of Westeros that their incest was not just acceptable, but actually holy, a sacred tradition that kept their divine bloodline pure. The faith of the Seven initially opposed Targaryen incest, correctly identifying it as an abomination. But after some strategic dragon demonstrations and political negotiations, the faith quietly dropped their objections. Nothing changes religious doctrine quite like the threat of being incinerated by a flying reptile. What a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms reveals through showing us the world at ground level is how ordinary people viewed this arrangement. The small folk thought the Targaryens were unnatural, possibly demonic, and definitely cursed by the gods. They were not wrong. When your ruling family has a coin-flip chance of producing a homicidal maniac every generation, that is not divine right. That is a public safety hazard with a crown. The series shows us people who serve the Targaryens out of fear or necessity rather than genuine loyalty, understanding that any day their reasonable king might be replaced by his mad son who thinks he is a dragon and everyone else is fuel. The genetic consequences extended beyond just mental illness. Stillbirths were common in the Targaryen line, with multiple queens delivering deformed or dead children. Some babies were born with dragon-like features, scales and tails, and wings that did not work, monstrous hybrids that died within hours. The Maesters documented these births in hushed tones, noting patterns that suggested the human body was actively rejecting whatever genetic cocktail the Targaryens were creating. These were not random tragedies. They were predictable outcomes of extreme inbreeding that any modern geneticist could have warned them about. The darkest secret, though, is how this affected Targaryen decision-making at the highest levels. Kings who were sane lived in constant fear that their children would be mad. Fathers looked at their sons and wondered if they were seeing the next Aegon, the Conqueror, or the next Maegor the Cruel. This paranoia led to succession crises, coups, and the dynasty consuming itself from within. The Dance of the Dragons was not just a dispute over succession rules. It was a manifestation of the fundamental instability that genetic roulette creates in a hereditary monarchy. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms also explores how this affected individual Targaryens psychologically. Ed grows up knowing that madness runs in his family, watching relatives exhibit concerning behaviors, and constantly questioning whether his own thoughts and impulses are normal or the first signs of the family curse. Imagine living your entire life wondering if you're going insane and having actual statistical evidence that it is a coin flip probability. That is the psychological burden every self-aware Targaryen carried. The series shows us how this genetic instability contributed to the Blackfire rebellions. Part of the appeal of the Blackfires was that Demon Blackfire, despite being a bastard, seemed sane, competent, and charismatic in ways that contrasted sharply with the legitimate Targaryens who were exhibiting troubling behaviors. People were willing to overlook illegitimacy for stability, which tells you everything about how desperate the realm was for rulers who were not one bad day away from burning cities. The ultimate tragedy is that the Targaryens could have fixed this problem at any point by marrying outside the family consistently. Several Targaryens did marry outside the bloodline, and their children tended to be more stable, but the dragon rider mystique and the political advantages of keeping power concentrated within one family kept pulling them back to incest. They chose short-term dynastic advantage over long-term genetic health, and it destroyed them. Thanks for watching Westeros Throne, and we will catch you in the next one.